Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get started because we don't have tons of time. What time am I supposed to be finished? 10:35, see? So there you go, 55 minutes. I'm on it. Hi, my name's Linda Brault. I direct the Map to Inclusion and Belonging. Have any of you been to the Map to Inclusion and Belonging website? That is going to be a really important resource for you, hopefully, in the future. So I have some information about how to get there. The Map to Inclusion and Belonging is funded out of the Department of Education Early Care and Learning Division, and we've been operating for a long time. And sort of like they were talking next door, we want to put all the resources for people in one place. So we sort of curate things for you. So if you are interested in looking at inclusive supports, we have coping with trauma for children with disabilities. We have disability-specific information. And more importantly, we have a whole lot of information about the book I'm about to share with you, which you will get a copy of if you're here physically. Ooh, so there you go. So MAP is primarily geared toward providing resources for early care and education providers, birth through age 12. We even have some after high school 21 things. And it's a lot of comprehensive resources. And one of the things that we have as a coordinator, Cindy Garstein-Kerslake, who loves feedback and loves people to call and say, or to email and say, I was looking for this resource, can you help me? Because then she'll help you, and she loves to do it. So I put her information in the PowerPoint slide also. So if you download this PowerPoint slide, you'll have it. But it's map at wested.org. So we do work for the West Ed Center for Child and Family Studies. So when you go to find us, this is our website, CA for California, inclusion.org. So California Inclusion, cainclusion.org. And then there's a map of California in the middle. So you click on the map. Isn't that kind of clever? Ha-ha. And then you get to this welcome page. And on the welcome page, you will see reference to Inclusion Works, which is this book right here. And the entire book, you'll have it, but those of you watching at home can download it. It's downloadable as well because it's a CDE publication. So that's the good news. So we do have it for you physically, but you can also download it. There is a PowerPoint to walk you through some parts of it if you're interested. And we're going to talk about that today. So having just come from, that last keynote, in talking about inclusion and support, my background's in early intervention and early childhood special education, but I've been working primarily with birth to 5 for the last several years. So how many of you are birth to 5 providers? The majority in here. How many of you are TK? And how many of you are 1st through 3rd? So a lot of you are all over the place. Well, that's good. Inclusion is more than having kids in the room. And that's an important element for us. So my influence is Norman Kuntz, and he's someone that I really recommend learning from. And he has this to say: when inclusive practice is fully embraced, we abandon the idea that children have to become normal in order to contribute to the world. Instead, we search for and nourish the gifts that are inherent in all people. We begin to look beyond typical ways of becoming valued members of the community, and in doing so, begin to realize the achievable goal of providing all children with an authentic sense of belonging. So one of the things that I'm hoping you'll hear is some of the things that we can do that will help children feel a connection, a sense of belonging to their classroom, to their teacher. And as you're looking at how you support children and how all children can access the information, I'm going to give you some strategies and techniques, and I want us to keep in mind our goal is always to avoid the, okay, Jeffrey, it's your turn to go to speech. Unless it's like, woohoo, everybody gets to go to speech. Isn't that cool? But I think that we have to get beyond seeing children as less than. And we don't need to feel sorry for children. We need to celebrate what they have and what they can do. So the information I'm going to share today is from the book Inclusion Works, and there's the whole long address, but if you just get to the map of California and click on it, you'll see Inclusion Works. It won't be hard for you to get to. And we are updating it, and we will have video exemplars to go with it. So that's the good news. And we have several chapters, and I'm just going to give you a little information because it's going to be a resource that'll go beyond math, but it can help you in all those things. So the introduction has some about who the kids are that we're writing this about and what we're talking about. Then there's a rationale for including children with disabilities in inclusive settings. And I think one of the important points is you already are, right? So many children are not even identified prior to being in a group setting. So there are children with disabilities and other delays in every early care and education setting, whether people know it or not. And so that's part of the rationale is if they're there, let's be ready and let's be supporting them. And then when you look at inclusive childcare and quality care and creative inclusive childcare programs. So if, when we look at the providing inclusive childcare, we really, again, are emphasizing belonging. And I often talk about Maslow's hierarchy. Do you all remember Maslow's hierarchy from classes? And in the beginning of Maslow's hierarchy, it talks about having the physiological needs met and your safety needs. Those are the foundational parts. And after that comes belonging, connection, relationships. And only after those three are firmly in place do we get to learning. And so what we need to do is recognize, just as they were intimating in the last talk, if children are aware that they aren't belonging, that they don't belong in a setting, they're spending a lot of their energy trying to figure out why or figuring out how to belong. And when they're spending that energy, they don't have the brain power to pay attention to what they should be learning. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, and why, when you're including a child with any kind of disability, you want to always be thinking about how do we make the change that we're adapting or the thing that we're doing supportive for all children. We will have, universal design is important. I'm going to give you there's two kinds of universal design. The first is the physical difference. So if we look at universal design, that's how there's an elevator as well as stairs to get up here. That's when you are going across a street, there's a curb cut. Those are some physical differences to make things available. In classrooms, we don't always think about that, but we should. You know, it's like how can children reach what's on the shelving? How can they identify and find what's there? It's why we have, you know, places that show the blocks where they belong, or maybe there's a picture on the basket where the toys go. That's part of this. It's making it accessible and helping promote a yes environment. So here's this clearing a path. The child who's a wheelchair user says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the guy says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I'll clear the ramp for you." And he says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So it helps everybody. So universal design for learning, they talked about it a little bit there, and what I think is helpful is to think of multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement, and multiple means of demonstration. So those are the three principles for universal design for learning that came out of CAST, which is the Center for Applied System. Oh, now I don't remember what it stands for. Anybody here? Anyway, it's CAST. I used to know. It'll come back to me when they aren't clapping and singing next door. But basically, your environment, curriculum, and activities are then inclusive of everyone. And I echo the person who said it includes language differences too. That what we find is universal design supports children who are multilingual and who are learning different languages, because you're again thinking of all those different ways of making things available to them. So when we get to the chapters 2 and 3, we talk a lot about how quality is the most important part of a high-quality inclusive setting. Because if you're teaching in a place where the quality is not good, your first children who are going to have trouble are the kids with behavior and disabilities. The kids with behavior challenges and disabilities, because they don't have the coping skills that other kids do. So when your circle time is 40 minutes long, they're the ones that are going to be rolling around on the floor and getting up. And it's the other kids are going, I wish she'd be done, I wish she'd be done, but they're not getting up because they've learned a little bit more. So it's interesting that sometimes it's helpful to realize, oh, you know, I'm going to get good clues about the quality if kids who are struggling are the kids with disabilities and other kinds of things, because truthfully, that's who can help you identify when things are not really of a high quality. The other thing is that if you're trying to support inclusion, it's important to have people that are champions for it, and to have people that know that you have to look at each child individually. And one of the things that I think is helpful for working in the early care and education field is, just as they were saying there, we know that every child does not wake up on their, first birthday and walk. That's not when it happens. When you look at developmental charts, it says walking happens around a year. But some kids walk at 9 months, and some kids walk at 14 months, and everything in between. The same goes for every skill that's developmental. And one of the things we forget is that social skills and emotional skills are also developmental. So we have to be aware of the continuum of typical and how that moves along. So in chapter 4, we go into one of the questions that came up, which is, how do you talk to families about your concerns? How do you share those concerns in a way that is going to help the family be open to that? While not giving, that's a whole nother workshop, but I will say that the 2 things that I recommend if you're going to have to share concerns, whether it's concerns about development or behavior with a family, is, first of all, do not let that be the first conversation you ever have with them. Because if the first conversation you ever have with them is, I'm a little worried about your child, there's no relationship. They're not going to listen to you. You have no credibility. So you have to have had ongoing conversations across time. The second thing is you want to make sure you have a sense of where the family is at. So you're going to ask them, so how do you see your child? Do you have any concerns about your child on anything? And I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but trust me when I say, if they say everything's fine, it might be. Sometimes what they're doing at school is different than what's happening at home. And the classic is, oh, he plays fine with kids at home. And you're thinking, really? That's shocking. But then you say, well, tell me who he plays with. What do they do? Oh, his 13-year-old cousin comes over and they look at video games. And you're like, oh, has he ever played with other 4-year-olds? Oh, no, we don't have any access. So parents, again, they're answering you truthfully, but sometimes we don't ask the questions well. And then the final thing, there's 3 things. The final thing is you start the conversation with, I'm sharing these concerns because I want your child to be successful in our setting. So if you start, and this is in the book, so when you get the book, you'll see, we want your child to be successful in our setting, because parents' biggest fear is you're going to ask them to leave. You're going to say, I can't handle your child. And if that's what you really mean, then that's another conversation we need to have. But for most part, people don't realize that's what parents think. So if you're able to share, we want him to be successful, here's why I'm sharing the concerns, that takes away some of the defensiveness and worry. So that's my little advice, and it is in the book. And then we talk about how important collaboration is. When you have children with identified disabilities who they have a disability when they come to you, it's really important that you work with the family, which you always do, and it's important that you work with whoever is the other members of their team. So there may be specialists involved that you want to connect with and partner with. So this talks about collaboration and how that can work. And then Chapter 6 gives you a lot of specific examples of accommodations and adaptations. And so these are the ones now I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. So have any of you heard of the book Building Blocks for Preschoolers with Disabilities? Some of you? So that's a great resource, and Dave, I'm sure, has it for you in the back. Dave's here from Brooks Publishing. And so that's a great resource, and it really addresses a lot of these things, which are the curriculum modifications. It also talks about more specific embedded learning opportunities, and finally, some child-focused instructional strategies. So I'm going to go a little individually through this now. So are we all up to speed so far? Good. I had to get a drink of water anyway. So when we look at this list of common modifications, adaptations, and support, this is assuming it's built on high quality, good preschool or early care and education or first grade, second grade practices, that you're operating a program that's good for all children. And once you're doing that, this gives you some ideas. For some children, you can make these accommodations that are going to just make their ability to have access to the curriculum more easy. And one of the things that's important to know about this list is it's an order of the use it was observed in by classrooms. So the most common thing is environmental support. So let me give you some examples of what that looks like. I'm waiting for people to take their pictures. So if you are doing environmental support, you're altering the physical, the social, or the temporal environment to promote participation, engagement, and learning. So we're always trying to promote participation for all children, engagement, so they're more than just there, and learning. So what we might do, a good example, and many, many teachers do this, is you create an individual space for a child, right? So you might put a TV tray out when people have Play-Doh, so that they know this is their Play-Doh, and other kids have other Play-Doh. Or you put a mat down when it's time for sitting for your group setting, your group time, so kids have a defined space. That's an accommodation. If you've got a child that really has a lot of trouble with keeping their hands and arms to themselves, you give them a bigger mat so that they have a bigger space, right? It's that simple. And when you define the space, especially when you're looking at math activities, it helps children focus. So sometimes it may be as simple as putting a placemat under where you want them to focus, so that you're drawing their attention to the materials, the manipulatives, whatever you have available. The other thing is you can arrange smaller groups for activities. One of the things that it's hard for people to remember, but children do not learn during large group, whole group instruction. I would say that's true for sure up to third grade, and I'm here to tell you right now, adults are not too great at it either. But the truth of the matter is, when you're talking to everyone, half of the kids are tuned out. They don't know you're talking to them. And so teaching happens in small groups. You can reinforce, you can celebrate, you can do all sorts of fun things in the larger group, but that's not where teaching happens. And the hard part is, when we were all growing up, what we did is we lined up our little stuffed animals and dolls and we talked to them, because that's what teachers do. So we think a circle is where we teach, because that's what we grew up with. We didn't arrange the environment, stand back and watch the animals, stuffed animals, have fun. But that's what we have to learn to do, and we have to learn to pull kids into smaller groupings for that really important instruction. And when we do, we believe that if you think of the age of the child and add one more, that's the ideal size of the group. So if you're working with 3-year-olds, how many kids would that be in a group? 4. And if you're working with 6-year-olds, 7. That's not how it happens, and we know that. We know people go, okay, we have 24 kids, and we have 3 teachers, so each group is 8. And that's not a small group for those kids. But you can, within the group of 8, have 4 kids working on something on their own while you're teaching these 4, and then swap. So there's ways to do it. The other thing is, small group is not a time of the day. Some people think it's only during center time or small group time. No, anytime children are in small groups, you can teach. And there's a whole group of instructions for TK and above who don't have the luxury of additional adults in the classroom, for teaching children how to work in their own small groups. And the Daily Five, anybody know the Daily Five? So there's some really nice things that are around to help people, help children, and you spend the first part of your year teaching children the expectations for their own small group work so that then you have the ability to do that deeper instruction in small groups. The other thing is you want to have a free flow of, if you're doing a concept that has more time that children might need to process the information, to manipulate the task and the tools, you want to make sure it's not time limited, like the bell goes off and everybody has to move. You want to be sure that there's a free flow so children who need extra time with materials and extra practice have that opportunity. We also want to be sure the kids who are trying to avoid it, because there's those kids too, like they know this isn't easy, so they're not going to do it. You want to make sure you can find a time for them to come back a few times so they still get that practice. It may not be in one long setting. So just think about those kinds of pieces. Then the next most common modification are materials adaptations. And this is where, again, a lot of teachers do this very intuitively, but it's where you figure out how do you make the materials work for everyone. So now you can buy crayons that you can hold at the top that look like pegs, You can buy materials that are thicker. But all this means is you want to have stability for your materials. What some people don't realize, did I put this in here? Maybe, but for children who have difficulty with fine motor skills, and fine motor is a big part of math activities, often it's because they don't have good upper body and trunk support and strength. So if they're sitting on a chair where their feet don't touch the floor, they're not going to have as much fine motor ability. They aren't going to have as much attention to that. So one of the simplest things, if you've got chairs and tables that don't meet every body type, is to find little stool things that you can put underneath. I don't know if they still make phone books like they used to, but the easiest ones are phone books because you can make it any size you want. You can combine them, you can cut them in half or tear them in half. And what you do with that is you cover it in, wrap it in some tape so it doesn't wiggle, and then cover it in contact paper, and it's perfect. It can be used as a little place for their feet when they're sitting at the table. It can be used for kids in a group setting on the floor to sit on with a little raised seating. Not everybody can sit with their legs crossed. So again, it just gives you some options. They're like the best thing. Yes, ma'am. Blocks? Yeah, the really sturdy, strong, super strong cardboard blocks you can use for that. I have to tell you, I'm short. So that happens to me sometimes when I'm at a desk chair and I'm at a good level for working with a computer. I bought something to put underneath, but at home I use a game that we never use anymore as my little, I just have to admit. So that's one little thing that's a simple tool, but it actually will help children who are struggling with things that you might not even realize they're struggling with. And I challenge anyone to sit in a chair where your feet don't touch the floor and just see how long you can focus and work. It takes away your energy. When you're also looking at things that there's all this wonderful stuff that exists, non-stick shelving paper, just putting that down so that kids, when they have their food, things don't slip around or toys don't slip around. Taping a piece of paper to the table so that it isn't moving for kids that are having difficulty stabilizing the pen or the pencil. So just little things like that. Modifying materials, a lot of times we will want to show some samples to kids. You can stick it in a sheet protector if they're having difficulty and they need to see it. You can also put tape around the handles of things to make them fatter or to have a little give, which makes it easier for some children to grasp. And finally, if you've got things, kids who have sensory differences, I'm working with a program that has a couple of children who have visual issues. One child's totally blind and the other child just doesn't see well. And so they're using a lot of textures to help differentiate things so that they know kind of when they're in what area. You can also, if you have children that are resistant to Play-Doh or touching things that are different, you can put those under plastic or in a plastic bag and really encourage children to make use of them. And we used to allow paintbrushes when other kids were finger painting, because I had a child that would throw up every time he touched paint. You learn very quickly to find alternatives. Then activity simplification. This is one of the more important elements when you're trying to teach children who are learning differently. And again, I think it's something that is helpful for teachers to think about, because usually when I present to a large group, I have a co-presenter. And I can say something and people will look at me, and my co-presenter sometimes says the exact same thing and people go, oh. So, it's helpful to have different ways that you're presenting and thinking things. So, activity simplification, you can either break a task into smaller steps, or you can reduce the number of steps. So here's a couple of examples. If you have a child that gets overwhelmed, you can hand them things one at a time, so that they're not as overwhelmed. You can also use the mini pictures. If you want a child to do a sequence of things, you can have some visual reminders. Verbal disappears. Once we say something, it's gone. And verbal is not always easy for a child who's learning a second language. They may not know which word was important that you just said. The visual helps reinforce that for them. The other thing is to reduce the number of steps. So if it's cleanup is classic. People will just say, clean up. And first of all, some kids, that means you kick it under the bed, right? Or you close the closet and you're cleaned up. Other kids have no real idea what that means, and it just is like, I can't do this. It means everything has to look perfect. If you can say, pick up the green blocks and you pick up the blue blocks, or in this case, you provide the child with a basket with one item and say, can you find more like this, and put them in. So you're breaking down this more complex task and helping them. And then after the breaking down the task, you have the child and you need to help them do some things, and you help them clear their plate, and then you let them put the dishpan, but the last thing in. So it's the technical terms, backwards chaining. And then you leave more and more for the child to do, but you want the child to get that message, I have this, I can do this. And then last but not least, when you're thinking of activity simplification, you can make it more concrete for a lot of children. And that's one of the things that I love about early math activities, is we know we have to represent them with more than words. So we'll have, manipulative blocks. We'll have pictures of things that they can match the numbers, so that, as she said, they might recognize more, but then when they're trying to get more discrete, you're always having them manipulate real objects. Think of that with other things too. So if you're trying to help a child understand the expectation that they give a friend a turn and they take a turn, you might want to practice that and have some pictures that show you take a turn, I take a turn. So you're making it, again, more concrete. Child preference. This is when you capitalize on something the child likes. And we see that all the time. That the kids are all super into trains. So we've got, books on trains, and we've got some different kinds of train toys, and we might have conductor material, and we might take a field trip and go take the BART or some station or whatever you can do. And so you can incorporate that in a way to get kids to do things they might not otherwise be interested in. You can also let a child use like a favorite toy to come with them and watch them do something. We had this very fascinating situation once where most of the kids in a program, their parents were pregnant with another child. So it's like almost everybody was having a sibling. So the kids were obsessed with babies. And that's all they wanted to do, was to play with the babies. So one of the teachers came up with this great idea. Every child was assigned a baby and given a stroller, and they could take that child and park it at the puzzle section while they played with the puzzles, or park it over at the block area while they built with the blocks. Because that's what the baby's going to do for the first few months anyway, right? They're not going to really play. And it was a way of helping them do some other things that they could do that were in the curriculum that they wanted them moving forward on. The other thing is if a child is really having difficulty with separation or is sad, having a picture of a loved one, of them with their parent, can really help a child kind of help regroup and go through the day, because they can keep looking at that picture and know at the end of the day, mom's coming back. Incorporating their toy, so instead of the counting bears, you get some counting dinosaurs. Find some things that kids are more interested in. And then it talks also about if you've got almost every child, if you're in a group and there's multiple adults, there's an adult that the child is connected to. So let that person, sit by him when it's hard for him in large group, or let that person go over and work on the manipulative table, which this child often doesn't choose independently. And then that might encourage the child to go do that. So special equipment. Oh, here's my stable seating. I knew I had this. For children who have specialized equipment, it's important to understand how to use it and how not to use it. And then it's also important to think about equipment as, again, a way to enhance a child's participation. So I talked about chairs with armrests or chairs that have sides for a child that's less stable. The child's feet don't rest the floor. See, I had it in here. If a child is in a wheelchair, make sure there are other options for that child throughout the day, and find out from the parent what an appropriate other alternate seating would be. So, for example, they might have a chair that has a lot of stability. Sometimes it might be a beanbag chair. You want to know which is which, because beanbag chairs are not good if a child has got scoliosis or has some other issues going on. And so, it may need to be a sturdy chair. And letting that child lie on a wedge. Sometimes you can get a wedge so that the child's arms are available, and then when other children are on a floor activity, they can also be down working on the floor. And then access to places. If a child has limited mobility or has some fragility and gets tired, for example, you can bring some indoor activities outdoors. So maybe there's some little toy, figurines that they can play with near the outside area, so that they have something to do. Or you have a table with some manipulatives when that happens too. So this is the interesting one. I want you to notice how far down on the list this comes, because when people talk about including children with disabilities, the first thing they assume is that you're going to need an extra body, and that is not true. And the second thing they assume is that if you have an extra body, they will be what we like to call Velcroed to the child, which is also not true. In fact, we want to avoid that at all costs. So if you have adult support, it can look in very many different ways. So some of the ways is for an adult can scaffold through modeling. So if you have a child that's very limited in the kind of play that they do, maybe they just like to line things up, they don't really want to do some other kinds of things with the toys, the adult can be with them and model some new ways to play, or see if they can, encourage the child. Well, I'm doing what you're doing. Is this working okay? And get them engaged so that you can help them, drive the car windy before he lines it up. Little things like that. You can provide a photo of props used in the block area to help a child think differently. Blocks can build bridges, blocks can build roads, blocks can build buildings, so that children who may have limited thinking about what they can do with some materials get that vision. Help co-regulate. So a lot of times children have strong reactions to things. Have you noticed? And if they're upset, we have a tendency to feed off of that with them. So they're over there going, and we're going, oh no, don't do that. So what we want to do is we want to do the opposite. We want to offer that child some calmness so that we're co-regulating. We can influence how they're responding through our responses. That's a beautiful thing. So if you have a child that gets really upset, you can be sure that you're taking deep breaths and you're staying very calm, and you can speak to the child in a softer voice and maybe a bit slower and help them kind of recoup a little bit. If a child does not know how to interplay, the way most kids figure out how to interplay is they just get what the other kids are doing and do it near them. And then pretty soon they just sort of are incorporated. It's more organic than we teach kids to say, "Can I play?" And the danger is, the answer will be no. So don't ask, unless you've taught kids. I mean, sometimes if you've got a child who really needs that, we will teach children. And when he asks to play, that's your sign to help him, and we'll help you. But for a lot of kids, they just don't know how to interplay. Getting them to say, "Oh, they're playing with the blocks and the cars. You get a car and drive it next to them," and then see what happens. And so then you're able to help them get closer to it. And then find times that children are engaging in appropriate behavior and give them feedback when they are. What we find is children get the most attention when their behavior is not what we expect. Because when kids are doing what we expect, we don't notice. The best example I can give of this is I had a little guy. I was coaching in a classroom, and this little guy was so excited to be at school. And he was so excited that he would hug friends a little too hard, and his arms and legs were everywhere. I want to play with this, I want to play. And he was just this very enthusiastic child. And they spent a lot of their day saying, "Oh, gentle hands, keep your hands to yourself, keep your feet in place. Oh, your friend is had enough hugs." So they were interacting with him in beautiful ways, but it was all in response to these behaviors. And so when he was playing appropriately, they didn't notice. And it was interesting to me because I thought, anytime he's playing appropriately, he gets no attention at all. So I used to just go stand behind him when he was playing appropriately. So they could say, "Oh, you are sitting with your hands and your feet so close together. You're really helping your friends by keeping your hands to yourself." So this is something, instead of positive praise, those of you who have taken trainings from me know we believe not in praise, because praise is externally motivating, but we believe in something called positive descriptive acknowledgement, where you're really giving the child the credit for what they're doing, and you're very descriptive. This is another really helpful thing for adult support, and think about it with a child with a disability or peers of the child with a disability. If you can be more descriptive in what they're doing, instead of saying, "Oh, good job," which tells you nothing, but you can say, "Oh, you gave your friend a turn with the marker, and now you have a turn. You're sharing." So you've described exactly what they're doing. You've linked a word, sharing, which many kids think means I take the toy and never see it again. But now you're saying, "Oh, you took a turn, he took a turn, you're sharing." So you're giving them all sorts of information. You're also giving them attention when things are going well. And that's a key. If you've got a child who doesn't seem to like working in the manipulatives, and they're suddenly engaged with something, you can say, "You are spending a really long time with those dinosaurs, counting them today. They are enjoying the time that you're spending. Look at how happy those dinosaurs are." So you're not saying, "Good job," which doesn't mean anything, or "I like the way you're playing with the dinosaurs," which is all about me. You're saying, "You are playing with those dinosaurs. You are taking so much time to think about how many go on that paper. You're matching the dots to the dinosaur." So those of you who've worked with infants and toddlers, it's kind of a variation on sportscasting or narrating what the child's doing. But what's nice is when you're scanning for success, instead of looking for trouble, you will start noticing all these opportunities for children who are not always noticed when they're engaging. And this works for kids who don't have disabilities too. It works for spouses, but so I think that this is another underutilized, instead of saying you finally took out the trash, you can say, "Wow, having an empty trash can just made my day." And they'll be like, "Yeah, I did that for you." Okay. peer support. This is one I think a lot of people think about but don't know quite how to do. And one of the things that I find, especially as kids get a little older, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, they like knowing that they can be helpful. And this extends to the kids with disabilities too. They like knowing they can be helpful. So we don't want the child with a disability to only be on the receiving end. We want to make sure everybody gets a chance to help. So use a buddy system. Buddy systems can be very powerful, and you don't want to have a buddy system like you're stuck with this person all day. No, none of us would like that. But you might do, a random drawing of lotto cards, and you match the kids, and they're the buddy for this activity, and that's one way. Or there's lots of different ways you can buddy them up. But it's helpful if you've got a child who is able to do some tasks slightly differently or more advanced than the child that you're pairing them with. And it's good to have children take turns showing things, so that if you have a child with a disability, again, it's their turn to do something as well, or make sure they get a chance to be the lead sometimes. If you are trying to help children to be more leadership-wise with their peer, you can prepare them and say, you know what, Rosie is having a little bit of trouble when it's time for her to write and she gets really frustrated. You really like to write, so we thought when you're doing it, you can just say to her, you can do it, Rosie, you can write. Whatever it is, and then you give her that. Or you might say, sometimes when she's playing, she doesn't notice you're playing. So if you would just say to her, hey, Rosie, do you want to turn? And make sure you get her attention. So there's things we can do, and there are actually, whole programs written about how you can prepare peer partners. It's a lot of but it is helpful. And again, kids enjoy being in that role, but I think it's important that it is, again, not something that he's broken, so you have to help him. But this is something that you do well and he's working on. He does this well and he can help you with that. So you might want to, again, try to think of it reciprocally. And then encourage children to positively comment on a child's appropriate activities. So if you have a child that is often yelling or hitting, and you're trying to get this child to use words, then you want to say, oh, you know what? Amber is really working hard to use her words. You can help her remember, and when she uses her words, you can thank her. Because what I find is children whose behavior is challenging, it's not a secret. Everybody in the room knows. So you want and you want kids rooting for her. You want, instead of avoiding her, oh, she's going to yell at me, I'm going to stay away. But you're going to say, oh, she's really working. Hey, Amber, you are working so well at using your words. Everybody's going to listen, and when you use your words, they're going to say, thanks for using your words here. And so I've certainly done that. If I have a child that hits kids when she wants a toy, and I'm trying to teach her that if she uses her words, she'll get the toy, we have to make sure she gets the toy when she uses her words. And the only way to do that is to let everybody in. So you say to the kids, hey, you know what? We are working with Rosie to use her words when she wants a toy. So if she asks you for a toy, you give it to her and you let me know and I'll help you get it back later. And people go, well, that's not fair. Believe me, it's way better than everybody getting hit. And while you're doing this, you're helping Rosie say, sometimes people don't want to share. They don't want to give you the toy. Let's practice what we can do and what else we can do. Well, if somebody doesn't want to give you the toy, you can go play with something else. You can wait and take a turn later. So you're working with her on those skills, but you're also helping everybody see, hey, she's learning new things, she's changing. So it's a little thing. And this is our favorite. If you get the book, Building Blocks, they use icons for each of these areas, and the icon for invisible support is a ghost. So it just cracks me up. But invisible support is important. It's the things we do ahead of time that when somebody walks in, they go, gosh, this room, just everything ran so smoothly. And you're like, yeah, I was up late last night figuring it all out, right? So what we want to do is sequence turns maybe to maximize a child's success. So if this is a child who has difficulty with fine motor coordination and kids are building blocks, let them put the first block down. It doesn't have to, the stability isn't as important there. So if they're doing things, or here it talks about if you're making Play-Doh, let them stir before it gets hard. Let them do something that they're successful. If they're a kid that's going to fly the flour everywhere, let them stir when it isn't all floury and it's, less more sticky. Plan ahead to guide activity choices. One of the things that I find is some children do avoid playing with things that are hard for them. So if it's a manipulative math area, it's a lot of visual matching and they're not good at it, they may find ways to just not ever go there. So you might want to say, here's your 3 choices. And so you narrow down the choices for them and what they're going to do in this activity. And after those, then you can go to the dress-up area or whatever's the favorite. So we do a lot of first then. First we do something that's not as exciting, and then you get to do the thing you like. But it's not an if you do this, then, because that's threatening and we don't want to get marked down for that, right? So it's always when you've played with this, then you can do this. Or first we're going to do this activity, then we're going to go outside. And have multiple items of interest for the child. One of the things that people sometimes forget is that if you have a science area or a math area, you can have dress-up clothes that go with that. You can have lab coats and you can have important goggles or other kinds of things. So kids who really like dress-up things might get enticed to spend more time there. Or a child who really, again, likes trains, you might have some trains over in the area that are the manipulative, so you can figure out some other ways ahead of time. And then you want to look at your schedules so that you're really helping accommodate the child. So it may be that if this is a child that really takes a long time moving from point A to point B, you let them start first so that they have time to move, especially if they're not stable, before everybody's rushing. Or you make them the last person to put on their coat because they are going to need some help. And that way it's not so crowded in the coat area, so then you help them at the very end. You might want to look at how much active time and passive time there is. So if you have a child that has heart conditions or health issues and stability is a difficulty, making sure that this child is not going straight from, a very vigorous indoor activity to a vigorous outdoor activity, that you have some mixing up. And vice versa. If you've got a child that needs a lot of movement and they've just ridden with their parent for an hour in the traffic to get to school, don't have the first thing they do sitting. Make sure there's some movement options for that. So in your handouts, when you download them, there will be a handout that lists each of those areas, and your task was to think of a math lesson and how you could accommodate. So if you wanted to do this activity with colleagues, if you download it, it'll have those, and you can think, okay, here's a math lesson. How would I change the environmental support? How might I, go through the thing that way? So it's a way that you can look at those. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to give out the books so that you each get your very own book. And I'm going to see if there are questions, because we've got 5 minutes. So, and the book, as I said, is downloadable if you go to the map, the cainclusion.org, click on that map of California. You'll see in the little drop downs, there's Inclusion Works right there, so you can do it. So any questions? None? You guys are way polite. Or any ideas? Did you think of something and go, oh yeah, I could totally do that. Or I'm already doing that with a math. Yes. Here, I'm going to let you use the microphone, mostly for the people on the other end.
I've worked in special ed for a while, and sometimes people have a fear of inclusion because, all the reasons that Kevin talked about. But so what are some of the ways we're trying to break down the barriers? But I try to talk about how simple some modifications can be, and that it's not so scary, and that often you're already doing a lot of things, and that all these adaptations or modifications are good for all children, not just for the ones that we're trying to modify for. So are there any other tips or tidbits that you would offer to try to help break down that mindset?
So there's two things, and this is talked about right in the first part of the book. Oftentimes, if people envision inclusion, they think of the child with the most significant disability they've ever seen. So that's who they picture in their head. And when you say, well, that's an unusual, there's not as many children with that level of disability. And if you get a child that has multiple physical and mental and cognitive disabilities, there's a whole team of people that are connected to that child. You'll have lots of ideas. You are already including kids with the speech and language issues, kids who have more challenge with just processing the information. They're slower to process. So that's the first news, is to say most of the time people are envisioning a child that's going to need a lot of support that they don't have. The other thing that I find is most of the time the resistance comes not for fear of the child, but fear for the child. People are really worried, I won't know what to do. I won't be able to help this child. And again, I just say, you know, the first time you ever worked with a child that was younger than you worked with, you didn't know what you were going to do then either. So when we think about children, we want to just be open to asking questions, asking the family, what are some things that he likes? How can I tell what he wants? Like if you get a child that isn't verbal, so how do I know what he wants? What are some of the things he does for you? Does he use sign language? Does he use pictures? Because most kids are going to start having some alternatives. And again, if they have an identified disability, there should be some resources available from people such as yourself. But honestly, I think you're exactly right. If we can help people say, you already know what to do with it. I'm going to tell you, you've got a new child arriving. She's arriving on Monday. And she has a little difficulty with transitions. She likes to be prepared for her transitions. Sometimes she's a little hard to understand, and she moves somewhat slowly. And everybody goes, oh, okay, I got that. She also has Down syndrome. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, I don't know what to do. But you knew what to do until I gave that label. And sometimes that's the scary part. Just the label doesn't give you enough information. That's the other key is, if I say, oh, I'm going to enroll this child, and I call and say, oh, my child has cerebral palsy, I don't know how that impacts his or her development. And if you have cerebral palsy, you might walk with a slight limp and have no other problems. You might need to use a wheelchair, and you might have difficulty speaking, and everything in between. So we can't make assumptions when we hear my child has blank. What we need to say is, well, how does that impact your child's development and learning? And what are some things that you've found that help? So those are my short answers in my time that was allotted. So again, you've got the book. The second edition will come out in the next year-ish. And that will also be downloadable, but there's going to be video exemplars of each of these adaptations. And these adaptations, again, are not, you don't have to be a special educator to do these. These are all things that anybody can do if you get some information from people who know the child, whether that's the family member or another specialist. So thank you very much.